Well, 16 days after the government shutdown and 1 day before the deadline to raise the nation's borrowing limit, lawmakers finally reached a deal.
But it's only a short-term agreement. And joining us now with more is Democratic Senator of Virginia, Tim Kaine. Thank you very much, Senator, for coming in and talking with us. We appreciate you coming in and sitting with us this morning.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah, so the dust hasn't even really settled on this yet. You know, I think the first question that I would ask you is, what would you say to all of these furloughed workers who, frankly, are a little embarrassed by the intransigence on both sides?
Yeah, well, they ought to be embarrassed, and it was an embarrassing chapter for our country. There's no reason ever to shut down the government of the United States, and there's no reason ever to threaten our fiscal soundness by saying we're not going to honor our fiscal obligations. So it was foolish to begin with. Thank goodness we pulled back from the brink. I was the co-sponsor of the bill to make sure that these congressional staffers and other federal workers who were furloughed through no fault of their own get back pay. That's going to happen. Everybody's coming back to work today. So I hope we learn that don't threaten shutdown, don't threaten to default. That will, if we learn that lesson, it will be an important one. But now we've got to work together to find the longer-term budget framework, as you pointed out, Wisdom, that this is a deal that sort of extends government funding through mid-January and the debt ceiling through early February. But the real core of the deal is getting the House and Senate together in a budget conference, which we in the Senate have been trying to do since March, to sit down and try to work out a fiscal year 2014 budget and hopefully even agree on some principles that can last beyond 2014.
Now, there are a lot of people out there who were angry about what happened, that all of this came up to the last minute, and all of this happened. How can we reassure them that this won't happen again? Because basically this is just down the road. We're good until December and January and February, but how can we reassure them that this won't happen again? There needs to be conversations had. We know about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair for people to be skeptical. But the reason, if you really short form it, the reason the government shut down is because the two houses wouldn't sit down in a budget conference. The Senate and House passed budgets the same week in March, into March. And the Senate said, let's go to a conference and sit down. You bring your plan, we'll bring ours, and we'll compromise. The House didn't want to do a conference. And so if you don't do a conference, you don't find a compromise. If you don't find a compromise, there's no budget. If you don't have a budget, the government shuts down. So we are finally doing what we should have been doing since March, which is sitting down at a conference table. But there are hard decisions to make. The Senate and House budgets are different in terms of the dollar amount. There's about a $70 billion difference in the dollar amount and some significant differences in programs. But look, I was a governor, and I had two houses, and they would do different budgets. And then we'd sit down at a conference table, and you know how it works. Right. You win one, I win one. We split the difference on the third. We get creative on the fourth. You know, you just work through the issues, and we have to do that. There's no substitute for it.
Oh, I want to ask you also, you were there last week with some tense moments with Mayor Vincent Gray.
Absolutely.
And what do you say to your counterparts in the District of Columbia who feel like they were somewhat disrespected?
Well, the fact that the district budget is tied to the federal budget and the district can't even spend its own money if the federal government does something like this is crazy. So we ought to figure out a reform to that. I mean, I'm in favor of district statehood rights, but short of that, even before we get over that hurdle, we ought to figure out a way to let the district operate its own budget. I was a mayor, too. I was mayor of Richmond. You know, whatever happened at the federal level, we were going to operate our services at the city level, and the district's budget should not be clamped if something like this happens. Now, hopefully something like this won't happen again. But we ought to look at a reform to free up the district to spend its own money during a
challenge like this. I feel like there's some mending of a relationship that needs to be done with the District of Columbia and their counterparts.
Yeah, I will say this. Nobody from the district ever called me to ask for help or advice over the course of this. But if they do want help on trying to separate out the district budget from, you know, this kind of dysfunction at the federal level, glad to do it. They have the ability to spend their own money.
Right. Now, you're also on the committee. You're on this budget committee, this bipartisan committee with Senator Warner.
I am
as well. Explain a little bit about how you plan on doing your part to make sure that by December 13th is the deadline, that we don't have this happen again.
So Senator Patty Maria Washington is the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, chair of the House Budget Committee. We will be together in conference to try to find this 2014 plan going forward and to avoid more brinksmanship. And again, it will be tough. The two budgets are different, but that governors deal with that. So Mark Warner was a governor. He dealt with it when he was governor, and so did I. My biggest challenge once when I was governor is I had two Republican houses my first year that differed so wildly on the budget they took it into overtime, and I had to try to broker the deal between them. So I've been in these negotiations before, and frankly, there's no substitute for compromise. You know, you have to be willing We passed a budget, Senate budget. I feel very strongly about it. We could put it in place without changing an apostrophe or comma, and it would work. But we know the House is going to feel the same about their budget. So we have to be willing to sit down over the course of the 2 months, spend a lot of time at it to try to find the right compromise going forward. And compromise isn't a dirty word. I mean, there's some people in Congress who feel like we can never compromise. If we don't get our way, we'll shut government down. That's the wrong attitude. You have to be willing to do some give and take, and you know, it's just old-fashioned stuff, but that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple months.
Got to get everyone back to the middle of the road.
Right.
Yep, absolutely. With divided government, that's Americans picked a Republican majority in the House and a Democratic majority in the Senate. There's not going to be a deal that's not a bipartisan deal.
Right.
Senator Kaine, thank you so much.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
All right. Let's toss things over to Tucker Barnes right now and talk about weather.